Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us at today's Competitive Enterprise Institute event on the Nippon Steel U.S. Steel merger. For those who are not familiar with CEI, we are a think tank based in Washington. We focus on the regulatory aspects of numerous policies ranging from trade to antitrust to energy and the environment, finance, you name it, we cover it. Today's panel is about the Nippon Steel U.S. Steel merger, which is under political attack. Joining me today are Scott Lincicome from the Cato Institute. He directs the Herbert Steifel Center for Trade Policy. And we also have with us Jonathan Samford, who is the Executive Vice President at the Global Business Alliance, which works to advance the open economy. I'm Ryan Young, a senior economist at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We will take questions from the audience. You can email them to us at events@cei.org. We'll get to those towards the end of the hour, but at any point, if you have a question, please send it in, events@cei.org, and hopefully we'll have time to answer them. I think to start, we'll start with introductory remarks from Scott and then John, and then we'll move on to more of a guided conversation. And of course, please do send in your questions, events@cei.org. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Scott.
Thanks, Ryan. And thanks to CEI for hosting this and for everybody watching at home. Again, my name is Scott Lincicome. I'm Vice President of General Economics and Trade at Cato. And I'm gonna start with a very big picture, sort of table setting view of the U.S. steel industry's role in United States trade and economic policy, because I think that really gives a good context for the discussion we're going to have on steel protectionism and the Nippon Steel deal itself. And so I'm going to start with a little bit of personal history, because in some sense, talking about the steel industry, U.S. Steel, and trade is I have a bit of PTSD, or at least deja vu, in the sense that my personal history with the steel industry goes back basically for my entire professional career. I started as a research assistant at the Cato Institute in the 1990s. And the very first thing I worked on as an RA in the Trade Center was steel quota legislation being pushed by U.S. Steel and other steel producers to block foreign imports. I then departed Cato for law school in 2001, right as the Bush administration steel safeguards were getting put in place, again, to block steel imports, again, championed by U.S. Steel. I became a lawyer. Some of my first cases as a lawyer were anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases on various steel products like oil country tubular goods. That's a steel product we need for oil pipes. And WTO cases on anti-dumping methodologies we call zeroing. And then I ended my time in big law working on the Trump era steel tariffs, the Section 232 national security tariffs, the investigations, the exclusions, the WTO issues surrounding national security. And now I'm at Cato, and I'm talking about the steel industry yet again, whether it's on the 232s, we wrote a paper on that a couple of years ago, or now Nippon Steel and the political opposition to this acquisition. But I note that, this isn't merely a personal jihad for me or anything like that. The reality is that the steel industry, for at least the last 40, 50 years in Washington, has had a bit of a chokehold on U.S. trade policy. I wrote a few years ago in a paper just on general American protectionism, U.S. steel companies and workers since the 1970s have probably received more government assistance than any industry in the country. This includes hundreds of import restrictions, tens of billions of dollars in state, local, and federal subsidies and bailouts, exemptions from environmental regulations, special Buy American rules just for integrated steelmakers like U.S. Steel, and federal pension benefit guarantees as well. Big Steel earned these goodies through intensive lobbying efforts and strong ties to the U.S. government. There's a large steel caucus in both chambers of Congress, and the executive branch usually harbors similar fans. The coziness of this relationship likely reached its zenith during the Trump years, as several of the Trump administration's top officials, including U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer and several of his deputies, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, and White House Director of Trade and Manufacturing Policy Peter Navarro, all had very close connections to Big Steel. Now, I wrote that in 2017, but it continues today in 2024 as well. Before this, I looked up a few stats. I'll give it to you. 304 of the 675, so almost half of all anti-dumping and countervailing duty orders are today in the United States are on steel-related products. The 232s, of course, continue despite sky-high U.S. steel prices and now piles of economic analyses showing their harms for the U.S. manufacturing sector. The Biden administration is not blameless in all of this big steel pandering either. It is negotiating a carbon tariff regime of sorts with the Europeans and others, again, to boost the American steel industry and protect them from supposedly dirty imports from other countries. The U.S. has taken positions at the WTO, especially on dispute settlement, that are very much driven by those aforementioned trade remedies and the Section 232 national security cases, which are really abuses of U.S. law and WTO rules, strongly backed by the steel industry and the United Steelworkers Union. It has gotten to the point, for better or worse, that now with Nippon Steel, it is really openly acknowledged, whether in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Bloomberg, and elsewhere, that President Biden's opposition, J.D. Vance's opposition, and others to the Nippon Steel acquisition has nothing to do with economics, which are quite sound, has nothing to do with shareholder concerns, which shareholders are probably in support. They're voting on this actually today, but has everything to do with winning the 2024 presidential election, winning crucial Senate seats in Ohio and Pennsylvania, even though the aforementioned protectionism is a big reason why Nippon wants to acquire U.S. Steel in the first place. But yet again, here we are dealing with the politics. And then finally, I'll close with, I think, another important point of context. Everything I just mentioned, all of this special protection is provided to an industry that employs only about 80,000 American workers and a workforce of around 160 million people, only about 11,000 in Pennsylvania, about 8,000 in Ohio. The steel industry only generates about 0.2% of total U.S. gross domestic product. Manufacturing overall is about 10% of U.S. GDP. So it's a tiny sliver of even manufacturing. And I would note, the tariffs actually hurt, the steel tariffs hurt most manufacturing. And the Department of Defense says that we only need about 3% of total U.S. production for national security purposes, for defense. So the national security arguments are pretty bogus. So we do all of this for an industry that is not crucial to national security at the broadest level and employs just a few people. Yet again, here we are.
Jonathan?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ryan. Scott, well said. I'm Jonathan Sanford. I'm Executive Vice President at the Global Business Alliance. We are a trade group representing the inbound business community. Those are companies that have found success in their home markets where they were founded and have expanded here to the United States, creating great jobs across a number of industries. So we have about 200 companies in our membership. You can find our full list at our website, globalbusiness.org. But these are massive U.S. employers. The average member company at GBA has about 12,000 U.S. employees. And most of that investment goes into the manufacturing sector. The lion's share is certainly in manufacturing. So these are companies that are actually producing products in the United States for not only U.S. consumers and businesses, but also for markets around the world. And so when you think about foreign direct investment, which is the economic term that economists use to describe when that activity occurs, a cross-border investment is made. What you see is it's a really good yardstick for measuring America's economic success. And the US is the top recipient of investment globally, but over time, our share of foreign direct investment has actually decreased. And as would-be investors are making decisions about where to invest, what we see is that portion of new investment coming into the United States has actually declined. And what we're actually seeing now is reinvestment taking a broader, more predominant role in that foreign direct investment coming here. So these are companies who have made investments in the United States and are reinvesting those profits back into their US operations. In going back 5 years of data from the government, that element of foreign direct investment accounted for about 16%. So reinvestment of earnings was about 16% of total foreign direct investment in the United States. Last year, just 5 years later, that number was 61%. So new equity is not coming to the United States in the same share as it had been just 5 years ago. And it's a trend that we've seen, if you go back even further, that gets more dramatic. Why does that matter? Well, I think first thing to recall is international companies in the United States employ almost 8 million Americans today. And in those jobs, they're paying about $87,000 in compensation annually. That's about 10% higher than the economy private sector average. In terms of manufacturing, as I mentioned, the lion's share goes into that. Today, 1 in 4 manufacturing jobs is actually at a firm that made a decision to invest and create jobs here in the United States, those international companies. And these companies are huge investors in R&D here in the United States, helping to drive America's innovation advantage. And as I mentioned, just in terms of exports, you're seeing a tremendous amount of exports being produced at these companies in the US to customers around the world. About a quarter of all investments or exports are coming from those international companies that are located here. Why do I raise all of that? I safely say it to say our number one investor in the United States are Japanese companies. And it's across the border, but certainly this deal sends a powerful and negative signal. The decisions that have been made recently by the administration send a powerful signal. I don't know how much pistachio cake it takes to make it taste better at a state dinner, but the signal that it's been sent that your investment into the US may not be welcomed is something that a lot of companies are paying attention to and deciding whether or not they want to make those investments. Specifically to the steel industry, as Scott alluded to, it's just a part of the economy, but just zeroing in on that part of the economy, international companies are playing a huge role for American steelworkers. Today, about 1 in 4 of those jobs are at international companies. And I would just note, at the international companies, they're paid about a 10% pay premium. So the average steel steel worker is making about $103,000 in annual compensation. That's 10% higher than the sector average. So clearly, international investment in American steel has been beneficial. We see that as well in some of the conversations around, why that is so beneficial. Because when a company invests here, they don't just bring the capital needed to purchase or acquire a company or to start a new firm, a new operation here in the United States. They also are importing world-class know-how. They know and are bringing that innovation that they've time-tested and experienced and imparting that on US markets. That's not only good for the companies here and the workers that they employ, it's also really good for the ecosystem where they operate. The whole community benefits from that investment. So this is a great topic. It's very timely with the Prime Minister's visit this week to Washington, his congressional address, and his meeting with the administration. I think that it's a lot to unpack, but really appreciate you having me today.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Scott. Before we proceed to the more general conversation, this issue, the opposition to the Nippon-US Steel merger, is almost entirely political. And we'll talk about that. But before that, there are 2 economic points I want to make. The first is that trade and economics generally is not just a one-play game. It's a repeat play, ongoing process. And the other is that there are indirect effects to this deal that could ripple throughout the larger economy, because it's not just the steel industry that could be affected. It could be autos and construction, anything else that uses steel. Jonathan, you were right that the political opposition to the deal, which is bipartisan, sends a message to potential Japanese investors. Steel is obviously more politically sensitive than some other issues, but there's protectionism afoot in semiconductors, tech writ large, pretty much any industry you can name. Japanese companies in those industries looking to invest in America and create jobs here might have second thoughts about investing in America. You noted that foreign direct investment had been declining for years, and I think the rising tide of protectionism has a lot to do with that under the last two administrations. And as far as the indirect effects go, again, this deal will not just affect the steel industry. If U.S. Steel, which is not what it used to be, is unable to take advantage of not just capital, but expertise, new technology, new management style, more efficiencies, that could raise car prices. It could raise construction prices at a time when inflation is still high. And although inflation is a monetary issue, prices can rise for more reasons than just the money supply. So this is it could potentially backfire. It's a lot bigger than just a Senate seat in Ohio right here. As far as the politics, this is where I'd like to start the larger conversation. And again, those of you in the audience, we are taking questions. We'll get to them towards the end of the hour. Just please send them to events@cei.org, and we will get to those. But the deal is automatically being reviewed. So Jonathan, there's a organization called CFIUS that reviews any foreign investment deal like this. Could you please explain what that is, break it down for our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. CFIUS, it sounds like a disease, but it's actually a really important part of the U.S. Federal government. It's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, and it's chaired by the Department of Treasury, the Secretary of the Treasury. But it involves a number, about a dozen and more different agencies, from the intelligence community to the Department of Defense and national security agencies, the Commerce. And its focus is on that portion of foreign direct investment that enters the United States through mergers and acquisitions predominantly that could impact U.S. national security. I should just note, I forgot to mention this at the top, but GBA, we represent 200 companies. We do not represent Nippon Steel as one of our members. And all of our companies are from friends and allies of the United States. So like where investment comes from, our companies, 75% of all foreign direct investment comes from 7 countries, all of whom are longtime friends and allies of the United States. Our membership reflects that. And so what CFIUS is tasked to do is to review deals as it relates to national security. And there have been efforts to try to expand the aperture of its mission, but we think it's really important that that committee stay focused on national security. We have been longtime proponents as an organization, which may seem counterintuitive that the folks being scrutinized are for it, but we think that it's really important because when deals become politicized, that makes the U.S. less competitive for foreign direct investment and all of the great jobs that that provides. The vast majority of foreign direct investment enters a market in advanced economies, not just in the United States, but around the world, through mergers and acquisitions. That's the primary entrance. Some greenfield, but primarily through mergers and acquisitions. And so having deals be politicized, which means delays or ultimately being scuttled, means that companies have to evaluate the risk of that in the deal making. And so if we find ourselves in an environment where international companies are not able to compete effectively in the United States for opportunities to expand and grow businesses in the US, that could create a real disadvantage and ultimately hurt US workers by depriving them the ability to get the innovation that these companies and the world-class know-how that they bring. I would just note in a different industry today, there was a story in the journal about how SK Hynix is working with Purdue University to help build the workforce they need for their brand new facility that they're building in Indiana. Those stories can be retold across the country. Our companies are operating in every congressional district in the United States, and you can actually see what it means for your state on our website. If you just go to globalbusiness.org. You can find that information on what foreign direct investment is doing in your state. But the Committee on Foreign Investment is a critical resource. Unfortunately, in this circumstance, that review process has just been underway, has just gotten underway. And what we saw from the White House in terms of its political statement totally usurps the authority of the Treasury Department in conducting a robust review. Our organization sent a letter to Secretary Yellen urging her to ignore the political pressure and to decide the merits of this on the case on its merits. We think that that's critically important.
Scott, steel is a symbol of U.S. manufacturing, and one of the most common tropes in politics and in the media is that U.S. manufacturing is in decline. And fair enough, employment peaked in 1979. It's been down since, I think, about 13 million workers in the sector. But how sick is the patient really, Scott? Especially since we have a lot of .gov emails in our audience today. What are some facts they should know about the state of manufacturing in America?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's all a case of the seen and the unseen, right? The fact is that it's undeniably true that the United States manufacturing sector has seen a dramatic contraction in employment. You mentioned nominal share of employment since 1979 has dropped, but look, as a share of the workforce, the U.S. manufacturing sector's share has been declining since about 1950, right? This is a long-term decline. The question, though, and then I would add, also on the seen side, also undeniably true that certain factories, certain mill towns, you name it, throughout the United States, but particularly in the industrial Midwest, have closed down or struggled. Particularly in labor-intensive manufacturing, so textiles, furniture, certain heavy manufacturing, certain types of steel even. But the unseen part of this is that the United States remains the second largest manufacturing nation on the planet in terms of output or value added. We make more stuff than the next 4 countries combined. Japan, Germany, India, and I believe South Korea is the 4th. But anyway, the next 4 combined. We make a ton of stuff. In a historical basis, U.S. manufacturing output adjusted for inflation is right around at its all-time high. It's kind of been hovering at that level for about the past decade or so. And on a per worker basis, we have one of, if not the most productive manufacturing workforces on the planet. Our American manufacturer workers produce more stuff per worker than really any major country. And it's like 6 times as much than the average Chinese worker. So we are a very productive workforce too. Now, does that mean everything is perfect in the U.S. manufacturing sector? No. Productivity is kind of stagnated for the last decade or so. But hey, jobs have actually increased over that period, showing kind of the connection between those productivity and jobs. And not every manufacturing industry is thriving today, but a lot of them are. And that includes, I should note, the things that we care most about in terms of national security, things, whether it's defense industries or transportation or aerospace, even in semiconductors. The reports of the death of American manufacturing are wildly exaggerated, though Intel has had a few missteps in the last decade or so. And so it is really important to have that context. When it comes to steel, even in the steel industry, you still have a large sector. I would argue probably too large in terms of output, but it's not this collapse this net collapse narrative you've been told. It would be better if we had more competitive pressures on the steel industry. We had less protectionism in the steel industry. One of the reasons U.S. Steel has struggled in recent years is because it hasn't upgraded its facilities to match more modern facilities like in Nucor or Steel Dynamics in the southern states. But overall, in terms of kind of the big picture, this portrait of weakness is exaggerated or outright wrong, depending on what you're talking about.
Maybe just to touch on that, if I may, Ryan, just in terms of what foreign direct investment's doing, I mentioned that the largest investment sector for foreign direct investment is in manufacturing. But in the state of Ohio specifically, 50% of all the FDI jobs, all the jobs directly employed by international companies are at manufacturers. It's huge. And over the last 5 years, the international companies have increased their employment at a rate of 13%. At a time when basically private sector employment in the state of Ohio has been flat. So what we see is a tremendous amount of investment. And I'll just mention the largest investor in the state of Ohio is Japan, followed by the United Kingdom and then Germany. The same story could be told to a similar degree in Pennsylvania. Tremendous amount, about greater than 1 out of every 3 FDI jobs in Pennsylvania is at in the manufacturing sector. 1 out of every 3 manufacturing jobs in Pennsylvania is at an international company.
Yeah, and I would just add, I live here in North Carolina, so I have to give a shout out to the Sun Belt in this regard too. Anybody who thinks manufacturing is dying in the United States, I highly recommend taking a drive on I-85 from, say, here in Raleigh all the way down to Alabama. And I think it'll dispel the myth of American manufacturing decline. And, as Jonathan noted, a lot of that is foreign invested. And I think a big point there is that, global investors, multinational investors have a lot of choices about where to invest. And they invest in the United States for all sorts of reasons. Very few of them being protectionism or having a protected market, and a lot of them being, access to a very highly productive workforce, a clear regulatory environment, a relatively low tax, and other kind of burdens as well. And it's unfortunate that some of that is potentially eroded, not only on the tax and regulatory side, but on the policy certainty side of things. There's a lot of, as I think both you guys have mentioned, there's a lot of economic literature on policy uncertainty and its effects on investment, especially in the trade policy space. And we saw it when the tariffs were imposed during the Trump administration. Studies show that it actually reduced investment in the manufacturing sector. Now, it doesn't take an economist to kind of figure this out, right? If you're about to spend millions or billions of dollars on a new investment, and there's a potential risk of that investment being thwarted, not for economic reasons, not because you lost in the market, but because of some political policy issue, political issue that's really out of your control, you can't out innovate, then you might hold back on that investment. And quite frankly, when I was in private practice, we heard stories of this, right? In clients, investors saying, what's going on with all of those tariffs? What's going on in this space? Is Trump going to slap a tariff on Mexican products because of immigration issues or whatever? Maybe I'm going to hold off on that investment. That's just bad for the U.S. economy. And so policy uncertainty, these kind of invisible forces that are potentially unleashed by things like whether it's the Trump tariffs or now this Nippon Steel holdup, intervening in the CFIUS process. I'm not as sanguine on CFIUS, but I agree with Jonathan that the political intervention there is pretty bad. Well, that's going to have not just a potentially bad effect on the Nippon deal, but on foreign investment in the United States overall.
That's exactly right. There's a lot more to this acquisition than step 1, block the deal. Step 2, win swing state congressional seats. There's a lot more to it. There's also more to it than the CFIUS review. The Justice Department is considering an antitrust investigation. It's too early to tell what's going to happen with that. We might find out later in the month if they're going to do a formal investigation. Right now, they're just nosing around a little bit. There's been no formal complaint, no official steps. But yesterday, we also got a letter sent from our friend in Ohio, Senator J.D. Vance, who is asking the Securities and Exchange Commission to investigate the deal as well. And I thought the logic of that letter was just fascinating, to choose a word. Scott, could you talk about that a little bit? Looks like I might have lost Scott for a second. The gist of Senator Vance's letter was that the U.S. Steel may have misled its shareholders because it didn't properly account for potential political opposition to the deal that might have scuttled it or reduced its value. And Senator Vance did not mention that a lot of that political opposition came from himself. And that's one way to win the news cycle for a day, but it's not the way to help the U.S. economy or even the steel industry that Senator Vance really hopes to help. So if we could go back
Ryan,
to the...
just to kind of, mention a little bit about the uncertainty around the investment from Nippon. As I mentioned, they're not a member of GBA, but I think it is worth noting that they've operated in the United States for 4 decades. This is not their first entry into the market. This is one of those companies that's reinvesting the profits back into their business here, or trying to. They currently employ about 4,000 Americans here already, have for decades, as I mentioned, and they, including, I think several of their operations are in partnership with organized labor. So this is an entity that is known within the U.S. and within the market, certainly here in the U.S. And that's why I think it was so surprising to see the president's statement. I don't know if everyone was following this. We were following it very closely, but a couple of weeks ago, the president, through one of his press secretaries, released a statement saying that he thought that the deal should be done with American entities, American headquartered firm. And then he was asked about it during the state visit this week with the prime minister visiting. There was a question asked at the joint presser, and he underscored that point. So without any serious review of the merits of the deal, the White House has been clear on this. We also know that the previous president has been quite clear on this in responding to that initial statement from this White House. I think it's clear that it may be his pen, President Biden's pen, that is driving, that will ultimately have a factor on the deal going through. But it's, I think, former President Trump's hand on the pen, kind of forcing the hand here. So it's definitely bipartisan skepticism. And what is, I think, most disappointing from our perspective with the administration's decision here is the fact that this administration has actually tried to encourage more foreign direct investment into the United States. For 50 years, presidents from both parties have issued and reaffirmed what's known as the open investment policy of the United States, which is to underscore that we a pledge to treat companies who invest here the same as any other company operating here. And so to see that gross departure from that policy was particularly disappointing.
Yes, and I think that leads into another angle that we need to cover today, and that is cronyism. Nippon Steel is not the only... We have a little bit of feedback there. Excellent, that's fixed. Nippon Steel is not the only bidder to buy U.S. Steel. There's also Cleveland-Cliffs, which is the number 3 steel producer in the U.S., much larger than U.S. Steel. And whereas Nippon Steel offered $54 per share of stock to purchase, Cleveland-Cliffs only offered $30 a share, which is 45% less. And yet, their CEO, Lourenço Gonçalves from Cleveland-Cliffs, has been very vocal about blocking the Nippon Steel bid. And I wonder if there might be something else going on there. Scott, is that something you'd care to touch on?
Well, I certainly am not going to make any conspiracy theories, but I'll note a couple of things. One is that look, the United Steelworkers Union has actually been working with Cleveland-Cliffs on this bid for U.S. Steel. The United Steelworkers Union, of course, is politically powerful, and the Biden administration is courting the union. Won the union's endorsement coincidentally right after the president came out against the Nippon Steel deal. Who knows if those dots connect, but certainly, there's a lot of coincidences there. I would add one of the, I think, ironic things about the Cleveland-Cliffs involvement is that if Cleveland-Cliffs was successful in acquiring U.S. Steel, it would raise major, actually legitimate antitrust concerns, because the combined entity would control more than 100% of certain steel markets in the United States, which, when combined with giant tariff walls we have around the country, mean a true and legitimate government enforced monopoly, right? So that's not it's amazing that we're seeing an antitrust review of the Nippon Steel side, given some of the potential problems with the alternative, the politically preferred bidder, perhaps in Cleveland-Cliffs.
Yeah, it's hard to monopolize a global market, and it's even hard to monopolize the domestic market. But when you have government putting up tariff walls and all kinds of other interventions, private monopolies can't not sustain themselves. The Supreme Court even ruled on that in the Matsushita case in 1986. But with government help, you can monopolize anything.
Yeah.
But one of the things that the Cleveland-Cliffs CEO said, among other whoppers, he said that Japan in the steel trade is worse than China. Japan continues to be a serial dumper in the United States. And he also said, and Jonathan, this is something I want to ask you about, he said that Japan is not a friend of the United States. I have a feeling that most people in the US government and most people in the US generally might have a different opinion.
Well, certainly the President of the United States does. Certainly the Secretary of the Navy does. The Secretary of the Navy, the ambassador to Japan, they just a couple of weeks ago were actually imploring Japanese shipbuilders to come help reopen a facility here in the United States to help make Coast Guard ships. They were, at the same time this was all happening in Washington with this deal on the steel side, we actually had U.S. officials in Japan trying to make the best case to come to and invest more in the United States, which I thought was an interesting juxtaposition. The state visit, you heard there's from the White House across the board that the alliance is as strong as it's ever been. I'll take them at their word on that. And I think it's certainly the case that in terms of the economic ties, Japan, again, being the largest investor in the United States, these are companies that are providing world-class know-how, continual improvement, and world-class partnerships as well. Companies like Toyota, who have led the industry in terms of working with partners within the industry to create a workforce that is capable of the high tech manufacturing necessary to do that type of work here in the United States. I mentioned SK Hynix in the semiconductor space, many other industries where that is taking place, and that partnership and collaboration, not only bringing the capital they need to invest here, but also the world-class know-how. It's a total win-win. And so I certainly understand the motivations that might be driving his rhetoric on that, but I don't know if it's widely supported.
And speaking of Japan as a friend, they are an ally in a part of the world where we need it. They are across a strait from China. The US already withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership at the very beginning of the Trump administration. The Biden administration's IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is not going anywhere. And if it does, they've already stripped out all the trade provisions. So the whole agreement is trade unrelated agreements, essentially imposing progressive wish list policies on China's neighbors, which from their perspective probably isn't that different from Beijing pushing their policies on them. It's, do you want one country's policies pushed on you or another? So this gesture to Japan is less than helpful, and it's also the latest in a series. I'm going to turn now to a couple of questions that we have from the audience. Mark Rusthoven asks, what is the latest on the negative economic effect of steel tariffs on total U.S. manufacturing output? That's either one of you can take that one.
I haven't seen the study that has been that is most commonly discussed with this. I haven't seen an update on. So it looked at steel tariffs from before the pandemic and showed a pretty significant. It's about, well, significant for economists, a small decline in manufacturing output overall because of the steel tariffs and a loss of a couple 100,000 manufacturing jobs for the same. I don't think there's been a update to that in the last couple of years, though. But there's no reason to think that any of that changes. If you look at, there's a great website called Steel Benchmarker that shows you U.S. steel prices versus world market prices in China and prices in Europe. And U.S. steel prices are always substantially higher than basically anywhere else in the world. So it's pretty hard to think that, and that's not just import prices. That's all prices, imports and domestic. So it's pretty hard to think that American manufacturers aren't struggling with some sort of competitiveness disadvantage based on when they're paying that much more for a critical input. And in fact, you don't even have to take my word for it or the economist's word for it, because you're seeing thousands and thousands of requests come in for exclusions from our steel tariffs. You're seeing at the same time from American manufacturers, you're also seeing requests for more protection from downstream products, things like nails, so stuff made from steel, because American companies suddenly say, oh, we can't compete, and they go to our trade remedies laws to seek additional protection from unfairly priced imports, which really just means imports that aren't subject to their own foolish steel tariffs. So you put all the kind of anecdotal evidence with the academic research from before, and it's very safe to assume that the damage continues today.
That's exactly right. We have a question from Brian Riley of the National Taxpayers Union.
Who? Brian Riley. Oh, that guy. Sorry, go ahead.
He says, it seems like there is broad-based agreement that we should work more closely with our allies to strengthen our supply chains and strengthen our alliances to promote an alternative to China. Should that be part of the discussion regarding the proposed steel acquisition?
Yeah, let me start with that, and I'm sure Jonathan has on-the-ground context. But yeah, it's incredible. One of the most incredible parts about this whole Nippon Steel kerfuffle is the China angle, because the U.S.-China Committee, very hawkish on China, right? One of the recommendations in its big report was to whitelist investment for CFIUS. So basically fast track investment coming from Japan, of all things, as a way to kind of counterbalance and, as a kind of a China policy, right? By boosting investment from close allies like Japan. And the reality is that was, of course, the basis for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or one of the reasons for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, again, was increasing cooperation and economic ties among the United States and its allies, providing kind of a balance to China's economic heft and gravity in the Asia-Pac region. So yeah, it makes tons of sense economically, it makes tons of sense geopolitically. Every once in a while in Politico, you hear these anonymous rumblings from State Department officials wishing that we could get in the trade game, particularly in the Asia Pacific. But let's face it, the reality is that this is not an economic or a geopolitical question. It's a political question, and it's the politics driving the bus, which, as I noted it in my intro, it's the one silver lining is that we're seeing basically everyone acknowledge that in the press today, that this has really nothing to do with those substantive policy things. It's all about winning elections in key swing states.
Yeah, maybe
Jonathan,
picking up on that last point and broadening it out a bit, I think my initial response to the question was, wouldn't that be refreshing? The USTR is underway in collecting comments on a new era of trade agreements. They're seeking comments on what that should conceive of. One of the questions they specifically ask in that is, how can we work with partners and like-minded nations to enhance our trade relationships and strengthen our supply chains? I think if you look at any list of economic freedom, and then you compare that to where we have formal trade relationships, it's a very divergent list. And so, I think it makes total sense to work with large partners. As I mentioned, there are 75% of all foreign direct investment in the United States, which is when a company is investing and creating jobs here in the US. 75% of that comes from just 7 countries. Of those 7 countries, only one currently has a relationship in free trade with the United States, Canada. The rest are not enjoying that collaboration. I think that seems like a no-brainer place to start in terms of strengthening the relationships with like-minded nations. And then, just to also highlight that in terms of investment in the United States, China, and this probably may surprise some folks, I spend about 80% of my time talking about Chinese investment and its impact. It actually only constitutes less than 1% of all foreign direct investment in the United States. It gets probably 80% of the attention, but it's about 1% of total investment. And it's actually been on the decline over the last 5 years. Chinese companies are not investing in the United States, partly due to some of the enhanced scrutiny we've seen with the CFIUS program. That was updated by Congress in the previous administration, 2018, through a bill called FIRMA, which gave it new authorities and more robust enforcement. The current administration is actually just yesterday come out with some regs that are looking to further penalize companies who are non-compliant or break the mitigation agreements. So I think that mechanism has helped address the concerns that many policymakers have as it relates to Chinese investment, but to not lose sight of the tremendous benefits that international companies as a whole, particularly those from like-minded friends and allies of the United States, offer America's workforce and local communities.
We have a few more questions in the queue. If you'd like to add your own question, please send an email to events@cei.org. Before we get to those, I would like to draw one of my favorite distinctions, and that is the difference between policy and politics. Policy asks, how can we make things better? Politics is, let's fight. Policy is about the merits of the issue. Politics is about vibes, and some of the vibes coming off the Nippon U.S. Steel opposition seem like a good old-fashioned scare story or moral panic, similar to along the lines of all the anti-Japan hysteria we saw in the 1980s. Are either of you seeing any parallels there?
Well, I can speak anecdotally. Certainly that's the case. Our organization was actually founded kind of in that environment where people were concerned about the buying up of America from Japan. That's certainly not been the case, as 30 years has shown. But it's also been borne out in some recent reporting. I think it was Reuters asked Japanese companies what their views are about the relationship with the United States and what it might be next year. And over half of them said they are actively concerned about the relationship. So this uncertainty, as Scott mentioned, certainty is critical in terms of establishing the competitive environment to attract the best know-how and resources from our friends and allies around the world.
Scott, I think you might be muted. Not sure what's going on there. Well, I guess in that case, until you're up and running, we have a question from Ken Kurakawa, who says that the Steelworkers Union is politicizing this to extract concessions, but union leaders and workers' interests sometimes diverge. Does that come into play, and is there a way to communicate better the benefits of foreign investment to workers?
Yeah, is my mic working now? Sorry. We had a minor power outage right in the middle of this, so all my electronics are a little off. But so I'll start by actually dovetailing with what I was going to say before my mic failed. I think there's a huge disconnect, and similar along the policy versus politics lines, of talking to just every normal kind of the folks out there and talking to people who are actually connected to the factories and the towns that are benefiting from this type of foreign direct investment, right? Because I think you're going to get a very different story if you talk to somebody working at a Toyota factory or Kia down in Georgia or wherever, and those that are just kind of man on the street who don't have any connection to those facilities. And I think the opinions of Japan and Germany and others in those places is going to be different from kind of the general vibes, the political vibes that might be there. But at the same time, look, I think the other thing that's become very clear in the Nippon Steel reporting is that this is there's a disconnect between what the union wants and what the investment, at least what they think the investment is going to lead to. But that really, and what I mean by that is that before Nippon Steel ever got involved, U.S. Steel was investing more in right-to-work states in the South, and was moving away from these old blast furnace style facilities to more modernized facilities like what Nucor pioneered here in the United States, which are of course cleaner, greener, more efficient, and all that jazz, but that might not be hiring union employees. So for the United Steelworkers Union, this is an existential threat to their membership and to their not just economic power, but their political power. And so, certainly Bloomberg got a good piece on this the other day, that certainly they think they want guarantees that those blast furnaces, those old blast furnaces, are going to stay open based after following the acquisition. But that's based on what U.S. Steel was doing before Nippon Steel ever got involved. Now, whether
on that point, Scott, I mean, I think the executives from Nippon have been quite public, for support and trying to reassure the union on that front. I think they've went as far as writing an op-ed to that effect, outlining all the things that they are committed to in this investment. So what I haven't heard or seen reported is what the union specifically is looking for. What we've heard is that the owner of the other company wants it at a cheaper price, and that the union wants to have the president reelected. I think that's all I've seen in terms of what's been communicated from those parties.
Right.
But I think Nippon's been quite clear on what they, not only that, but also, they have a track record. They've been here for 40 years. They work with organized labor in their other facilities. They have 8 other facilities for those 4,000 employees. So it's not like this is an unknown entity.
Yeah, and I agree 100%. You add that those facts with the reality that of the USW Cleveland Cliffs tie-up, that you're right that there's not a lot of backing for the concerns that the union is expressing publicly about unionized labor. But at the same time, let's face it, there's often a disconnect between what union leadership wants and what what's good for everyday workers, and it could simply be a case of that.
We have a question from Sean Higgins, who is CEI's resident labor policy expert, and he has a little bit of common sense to offer, as he often does. Wouldn't Nippon Steel buying U.S. steel give it an incentive to keep the U.S. factories open? After all, why buy it if you're not going to utilize them?
Yeah, and why pay a huge premium? This is one of the more ridiculous aspects of this deal, right? That there is this idea that Nippon Steel is going to come in, buy up U.S. Steel, and then shut down all these factories, losing gobs of money in the process. I mean, it doesn't actually make any sense on the economics. And if you listen to both the U.S. Steel management and Nippon Steel's management, they have no actual intention of doing any of this. And in fact, are looking to upgrade these facilities and invest more in the United States post-acquisition. Now, of course, a free trader like me would say that's in part due because they're trying to access a very closed U.S. market with very high U.S. steel prices, and that stuff's bad. But that's neither here nor there, right? When you're talking about the transaction itself, it is utterly nonsensical to think that this acquisition is going to actually lead to Nippon just shutting down all of these U.S. steel facilities.
And Ryan, if I could just take where Scott left that off, I think the United States, when we have investment here from abroad, that gives those other nations a vested interest in our economic and diplomatic success.
Yeah, Bastiat had that old saying where goods do not cross borders, soldiers will.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea that no one buys a new car to drive it off a cliff. You make an investment in a precious asset because you want to take care of it, nurture it, and grow it, build it. So the idea that I will say that trade can be a complicated topic in terms of the benefits for the U.S. versus our trading partners. Sometimes, the calculus on that can be difficult to follow. I think to the question about how do we communicate on this, foreign direct investment is a very good yardstick for measuring how the U.S. is doing on a global scale. What is our share today versus what it was 10 or 20 years ago? It's less. But that means that companies have unprecedented amount of opportunities to invest outside the United States. And the numbers, as I mentioned at the top, have kind of showcased that. But when a company invests here, it equates directly to jobs, not only the current jobs, but future jobs, and not only the direct jobs, but the indirect and induced jobs, as economists label it, but those are jobs within the communities and at the small businesses that support the big investment, the big firms. There's a tremendous amount of ecosystem and gains that are built from those initial investments. And so to wall it off and to try to isolate the U.S. economy with a go-it-alone strategy not only weakens ourselves economically and hurts us diplomatically, but it really is really at a time where we can't afford to not compete on a global stage.
Yeah, and I'll just add 2 quick points. One is I shared in the chat a relatively recent article of mine on all of the benefits of foreign direct investment, because there's this very silly idea that foreign acquisitions don't count as real investment. And the economics literature on this really debunks that quite quickly, that foreign investment is not just good for the companies and workers, but the surrounding communities, the companies that compete or are involved in their supply chains. There's all sorts of these great spillover benefits that are found in the economics literature, and so it's a good thing regardless of form. And I would add, countries, governments, they say that governments don't compete, companies do, but in a way, governments do compete on policy, and bad policy leads to less of this good for investment, because capital is mobile and it has options. There are other places to invest. And when you have bad policy or a lot of uncertainty, you get less of this good thing. There's a great study a few years ago, just as one example of how past increases in restrictions on American immigration, on high-skilled immigration, actually caused foreign multinationals and U.S. multinationals to look to other countries to invest in innovation and R&D and all this type of good stuff, right? And they didn't do that not because they just didn't want to invest in the United States. They just didn't have access to the talent It's the smart folks they needed to make those investments work. You can do the same thing for tax policy, for trade policy, for regulatory policy, and again, for uncertainty. And so as governments compete for that really great investment, it's critical to keep both policy and bad politics in mind as well.
And with that, we are about out of time. Jonathan, Scott, thank you both. This has been an enlightening discussion. I've learned quite a bit, not just about the Nippon-US deal specifically, but also about foreign investment in general and how important it is for America's well-being and the world's well-being. Most of the world's wealth hasn't been created yet, is something that my colleague Wayne Cruz likes to say. And this is just one small data point in that thesis. So with that, I want to thank both of our panelists. I want to thank our questioners. I want to thank our audience. And I would also like you to please take a moment to fill out an online survey that's going to pop up when we conclude the event. Please do take a look at it, send it in. We do these events for you. So we want to know what we're doing well, what we can do better, what kind of speakers and issues that you want to learn about. You are why we do these. So with that, I would like to thank our panelists and all of you, and we will see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Great seeing you.
Thank you.